Hello, working, yes. Welcome back. We're now going to have a fantastic wrap-up panel, which I'm very lucky to be moderating, all offering such unique, complementary and international perspectives on the subject of today. Then we are going to have a very exciting announcement by Professor Gina Neff. And then finally, our wonderful trustee Anne-Marie Immerfordon is going to say the final words. Actually, that's the real wrap-up. This is the discussion that will lead to that. All of you, I think, in your way, act as a bridge between the national and the international perspective, which is so important this week for the AI Summit and the Fringe. Andrew, you've worked with some flagship initiatives with the Swedish unions, for example, over Spotify, as well as the Global Federation on Training and Agreements. Ivanna, you've just written a fantastic paper for the Council of Europe on one of our favourite subjects, the promotion of equality, in the context of structural inequalities that we're looking at. And David, you have been involved in guidance from UNESCO, the Council of Europe, and I think possibly the Hiroshima process as well, which will bring us super up to speed and help situate our discussions today in the international context. Partly for Ivanna's benefit, more than partly, I'm just going to recap a few of the things that we've heard in the panels through the day. From the first, but it's not going to do justice to them by any means. First of all, from the first panel, how can we really apply and think about the potential and opportunity of AI to solve pressing local and national challenges, including regional inequality? And I'm thinking in particular of Philip talking about how we really don't have an infrastructure for this in the UK, and remembering the striking words of Wilson saying, so you mean it's on us when firms say, what should we do about it? So thinking about different types of infrastructure that perhaps need to be developed in the UK. Secondly, from the regulation panel, we're looking for a kind of magic mix of hard and soft law, of law at a national level and an international level, of things that work for specific domains or sectors, and things that apply, principles that apply at the top. So I think that thinking about in this panel how we really operationalise that and how we move to the next stage of the regulation debate is super important, and work gives us a really important, the most important context through which to think this through. We've thought about how we need to, in the panel that you've only just missed, Ivanna, the importance of identifying, engaging with all stakeholders and using existing infrastructures, including unions, for that purpose. And also, I think something that's really come out through the day is consciousness that we are at a juncture. That it's not just a tale of two cities, it's a tale of multiple cities and multiple futures, depending on the choices that we make. And that came out very sharply, I think, from the sector-specific panel. So in healthcare, where there's a huge capacity, demand and engagement workforce problem, combined with genuine excitement from nurses blown away with the potential to apply new diagnostic capabilities. So, against that background, I'd like to start off by asking you all to introduce yourselves. I'm going to try and create a logical order, at least in my own head, with Ivanna, David, and then Andrew, and just tell us what you think is the most important thing in this landscape to make the future work.
Great, thank you. Oh no, right. Can you hear me? That's what
yeah.
it works.
Oh, yeah,
perfect. So, no, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me, and it's very nice to be here and see so many familiar faces in the room, and certainly people I used to spend a lot more time with before my life 2 years ago changed completely. and I moved to live in Frankfurt and work for a global company that is based in India, and I lived between, sort of constantly jet lagged between India and Los Angeles. So but it's really nice to be here. And I work in privacy. That's my main activity. So I am the Global Chief Privacy Officer for a large technology company that has 250,000 people. And so my work is leading on privacy and also leading on all the issues around AI and governance and compliance and all of that internally. But as mentioned earlier, I've also cooperated with the Council of Europe in relation to, and just co-authored the report on the sort of non-discrimination, and where we demonstrated the lack of overlap between algorithmic discrimination and traditional discrimination. But we'll talk about it later. But it's an in-depth report that is available, and we'll love your feedback on that. On what is most important to me, and what's most important is how we move forward. Because if you look at what's been happening this week, it's been hectic everywhere, from sort of the US and what's happening in Singapore on the sort of new initiatives, and the Global Assembly of Data Privacy saying, privacy and AI are absolutely compatible. That at the same time, we had all the sort of negotiations on the European AI Act, which are coming closer, and at the same time, the US order, which is, in my view, a very, very, very positive step, coupled with just this morning, Kamala Harris launching and directing the new institute within NIST to create the new standards. So a very pragmatic approach, which differs very much from the more nebulous one that we have seen this week this week in the AI Summit. So the next step for me is how we move forward. It's like, what is the next thing? Because we are talking about all of this so much, but what is the next step? What is the next sort of big thing that we do to create what you were talking about, sort of that mix of soft and hard legislation that we need to move? Andrew.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, it's me.
David, yeah.
Yes. So I'm David Leslie. I'm the Director of Ethics and Responsible Innovation Research at the Alan Turing Institute and a Professor of Ethics, Technology and Society at Queen Mary University of London. When I heard you speaking just before, Anna, it brought me back. I had the odd pleasure of being at the summit dinner, the initial summit dinner a few days ago. Asana, I wonder if you had the odd pleasure too of being there?
I did make it.
You did, okay, fantastic. Well, in any case, what was interesting about this dinner, one thing that was interesting, aside from the fact that they tried to sit me next to Michael Kratsios, who, I don't know if anybody knows who that is, former director of the OSTP, Trump appointee. Anyway, doesn't matter. But so I was listening to the speeches, and Michelle Donnellan gave the kind of keynote. And sitting there and listening to her, I immediately noticed a nice parallel between the Prime Minister gave this speech that launched the AI Safety Institute. And the parallel was this kind of narrative of the kind of pivot point in history, right? They had both framed, I don't know if anybody heard the Prime Minister's speech, but there's this kind of emerging narrative where what's being spoken about now in terms of AI or frontier AI or however you want to characterize it, is this idea that you've got this kind of axial moment where, on the one hand, AI can do global catastrophic risks, right? It can do all of the sorts of harms that we've been writing about for the past 5 to 10 years, and now in addition to that, it can create all of these existential risks and et cetera. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, AI could deliver immense benefit, right? AI delivers potentially an ability to tackle public health challenges and biomedical challenges, climate change, biodiversity issues. It's this whole narrative, world global poverty. And so in both of those speeches, there's this kind of picture presented where you've got like this turning point where either we can have AI for the social good, or we can go down the kind of rabbit hole of harm and destroy ourselves, right? Now, what's interesting to me about that is what that raises, I think, from a critical point of view is a question about what we need to be focusing on if we think about regulating AI. Because if AI is this kind of pivot technology, then wouldn't our concern be with who has their hands on the wheel of AI, right? Who's driving the agendas of AI? Who is setting the direction of travel, right, of the innovation, whether it turns towards the social good and public interest, or whether it turns the other way towards harming everybody, right? And what's interesting to me about that is, if you look at the agenda of the summit, if you look at the conversation now that's around the forming of a global advisory panel, or you look at the conversations around the new AI Safety Institute, one wonders whether or not that question about who is controlling the technology, right? Who is setting the agenda for these large-scale technologies, whether that's on the table. And I'm not sure it is. I think this is what we need to pay attention to, and yet the narrowing of conversation that's happening around the summit, even amidst having broader conversations like this, is something that we really need to think clearly about. Because if one was going to sort of reorient the sort of path of innovation in AI ecosystems towards the social good, one would need to get into the incentive structures that are driving the commercialization and scaled initiatives within the research programs. And the question is are we even getting into the sort of domain of incentives in the conversation? And I mean, I think it's a more difficult conversation to have when we think about the international level and whatnot. But it's definitely not it's not on the agenda right now to really think about getting underneath that question of the values that drive the technology. And I'll also point out that there's a reason for this, and I would say that if you've been in the ecosystem for the past few years, you'd notice that around the beginning of the year something changed, right? With the rapid sort of industrialization, commercialization of generative AI, suddenly there was this kind of rush and a shift of conversations and a new interest among the kind of larger tech companies to start to kind of control the conversation and to sort of get involved more aggressively in the way the kind of regulatory and standards conversation was going. And it's almost like, there's BC and AD or whatever. I think there's a before generative AI and an after generative AI, because I think the arc of commercialization and the speed of commercialization has really kind of generated, I think, a new constellation of power relationships to navigate from the perspective of AI ethics and governance, international AI governance. And on this last point I'll make, and what I think is important if we think about that shift is before generative AI, much work was being done and continues to be done, but was being focused on that had to do with this broader kind of values and rights-based thinking on AI. Work of UNESCO, Council of Europe, things that I'm involved in, various other initiatives, so much from the Institute for the Future of Work, right, around good work and rights and values-based approaches. And now, the atmosphere is one in which it's really about governing, technical AI safety in many ways, or coming up with governance mechanisms that might not address that value space that was kind of such a concern before. And I think there's an issue there. I think we need to really be aware that something has changed, and that we do need to sort of rehabilitate continuity in the conversation.
Yes, we're going to loop back to that. Andrew, we've now given you a short break since your last work on the last panel. So can you...
Cool, so I'll say a few things. My microphone working? Good. So sorry if you saw me do my intro last time. You'll get to see if I do it the same this time. So I'm Andrew Pakes. I'm one of the Deputy General Secretaries at Prospect Trade Union. I think for the purpose of this panel, Anna asked me to help contribute because even though my great love in life is grassroots organising and workspace organising in the movement, I also have the great privilege to do some of that work at an international level through, there's always great acronyms. So I'm part of TUAC, which is the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD, which may also be a countdown conundrum if you put all those letters together, which means I take part in the OECD's AI expert panel about trying to derive social partnership and worker voices on some of those. And I'm really interested in that. How do we locate policy and decisions that are being made now in the experiences of people every day through to trying to grapple with something which the world is very bad at, which is global governance. And my fears within this, there's lots of hopes. One of my great hopes is days like this remind me that we have the ability to tackle these difficult issues through the people who have contributed to these panels or in the room. And I wish more of you were in the AI summit. My fear is that we will get tied up in a discussion around global governance, which always overlooks the need for here and now action. So the viewpoint I always come is, how do we make this a discussion about everyday AI? The things which are changing in our lives, the thing that may change next. Let's put aside the robots coming for us or the Terminators and others and focus on what it means for us now, because I think that's where we build trust and we build capacity to manage change better as societies and then work out how we have those bigger conversations. You know, the AI summit is a bit like, it's like the Bridgerton of AI. It is the fancy gowns and the ballroom dancing, whilst all the intrigue and power happens off-set. And that's exactly what we've got in this. So my challenge is always, we need to have the people who are affected and impacted need to be at the ball. We all need to be able to dance when it comes to this conversation of how it affects our lives, because it will be profound. And I think we've got to accept and work into that. There is a brilliant phrase that my colleagues in the Swedish movement taught me and they use, which really gets to me to the heart of where it's at, which is that workers shouldn't be scared of the new machines. They should be afraid of the old ones. You know, there is no economic future for any of us trying to defend the status quo in the economy. There is no economic boost to productivity or prosperity in our economy or anywhere else if we try and defend what we've already got. We as a society need to be better at embracing change, but in doing that better, we need to make sure people see themselves as part of that change. And to me, that's the thing we need to grapple with. How do we live up to conversations around governance, about inequality, around power and who makes decisions with the widest set of people in them? And we live, you know, if we don't address the reality, so I'll go back to our Bridgerton in Bletchley Park, you know, the thing we need to talk about and no one talks about is the geopolitics of AI. Because that's what's happening, the whole debate over who goes, whether China's in the room or not, whether Elon Musk is in the room, which country is actually going to have most competition. If we don't name it and pretend it's not existing, we're not going to have a really good discussion about it. So let's name the things we know are on the table and then try and plot a path through it in a practical way.
Thank you, Andrew. Before I go to Slido, I've just got perhaps one question for each of you, if that's all right, and even if it isn't. So perhaps starting here and moving along the line again, David, why is a principles-based approach important? How much consensus is there, like internationally, and what's the next step in operationalising that? Those are actually three questions, but it's kind of it's like A, B, and C.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question back to you is, how would you have any approach to governance that didn't have some principles informing the practice, right? And so I think it's just about making explicit what those principles are. I think that thinking about governance present and future, I think there's going to need to be a dance between risk-based and principles-based. I don't think that they're necessarily run counter to each other, which is to say a principles-based approach can frame the way we understand risks, but risk itself is an important determinant of the proportionality of governance intervention, which is to say, just because you have a risk component in the way that you're framing a governance process doesn't mean it can't still be values-driven and principles-based. So I think that's important, because I think there's a tendency for those who just want to hand wave and not have any sort of meaningful regulatory or statutory intervention. It's like once you start talking about principles-based approaches, they don't want to converse. But you can have proportionate principles-based approaches. It's not like you're going to immediately you're not going to immediately stifle innovation just because you're constraining innovation activity on the basis of whatever set of principles, whether they're good work principles or the Council of Europe's rights and freedoms. I mean, you can have both, which is to say.
In fact, intervening with a fantastic question from Salma, which feels like a follow-up, so I'm going to use that one rather than mine. Why is this an all conversation and not an and conversation? Why can't we use this as an opportunity to move faster whilst the world is listening? So perhaps with a focus on equality, yeah. Ivanna, no, but that's the question for you.
I think there is something that and I speak with somebody who spent a lot of time in a country which geopolitics of AI is quite relevant, which is India, right? Yeah. And obviously the geopolitics of AI is a massive issue. You haven't read my book, because that is the topic of the book. in 2018. Right? So what I would say is we need to build on the level of consensus that we do have already. I mean, with all the criticism that we can make of the UK AI Summit, the fact that there are 37, how many, 27, 28, 20, what number? 28 countries signing on to a declaration at a time like this, to me is a positive step. First thing. Second, the fact that there is the US leading with such strength and an executive order, taking practical steps, to me is fantastic. And the fact that you have Kamala Harris, Vice President, saying, we are not just talking, we're actually doing it. And we are giving this, and that. The fact that you have India, NASCOM, publishing a fantastic paper on responsible artificial intelligence, and through setting a privacy legislation, which they didn't have before, setting up an India Digital Act, which de facto will govern artificial intelligence in India, to me is incredible. And all of this, the fact that you have the European Union with the European AI Act, all of that, to me, is an incredible step. The fact that you have, of course, you have the Council of Europe saying, hey, we do the international governance because there is so many of us, legitimate for the Council of Europe to say that. As legitimate it is for the UN to say, actually, we're working for the Global Digital Compact. We will set the rules. We will do the international global framework, right? And now they've got a group of 50 advisors working together to understand what is the governance that needs to happen. So to me, the big question is, another one, is how do we leverage this consensus and move forward on something that is actually going to be the team? Because that's the problem. The problem is, from a legal standpoint, I would love, for example, as a next step, to get the best legal minds that we've got all around the world and say, what is a governance that works? Is that looking at the aviation model, for example, that when you want to sell in a country, you've got to comply with some standards set by that specific country? Is it the atomic agency kind of model that we're looking at? And to be honest, everybody says AI is not nuclear. Well, yes, no, of course it's not, but that agency does work. Whether we like it or not, that agency has worked so far. So what is the actual model that works from an international governance standpoint? And how do we leverage this consensus, and who does that, to leverage that consensus to bring it to the next level? The question for the UK, to me, is different. The question in the UK is, what is the role that the UK is going to play in that debate? Where you have the US order on the one hand, the European AI Act on the one hand. What is the UK going to do with this on this post-Brexit? I mean, to me, that is the question. And is it the UK going to leverage, for example, the amazing legal tradition that exists in this country to contribute to a debate around the legal structure that we need? And to me, it's a legal issue. it's very much of a legal issue. I haven't seen, apart from one, I haven't seen a real paper really going into the debate, into the discussion of these are all the possible models. Yes, we have seen some stuff around pros and cons, okay, but a little bit deeper from a legal standpoint. That's where I would love to call all the lawyers on this. Women, possibly. No, seriously, I'm sorry.
I'm not a lawyer. So.
No, anyway, no, but isn't that the point? And because to me is, what is governance that has got teeth globally? How do we leverage this to do something that, and people say, of course, you know, the world is a mess at the moment. Of course it is. Of course it is. I mean, you know, but actually, you know, we're all saying the same thing to an extent across different countries.
Moving to Andrew and perhaps building off that. So can the UK still lead in responsible AI if we utilise, you know, if we deploy and combine our strengths, as Ivanna says, in regulation, in academia and civil society, as well as X risk and other forms of innovative AI?
I think it's a really good question. I think, you know, also this is, thank you for bringing Ivanna over and putting her in the room, because I've missed this level of challenge and conversation in this debate, and I think you're right. In my view on things at the AI Summit, we should take everything at face value. So the glass is half full, we've got to keep filling it up and work it out. I think my big sadness for the next year is going to be, I don't think the UK is going to resolve many of its questions on a whole range of things in the next year, because we're going to be trapped in a prism of, until Rishi Sunak calls an election and we work out who's going to run the country, the reality is, sorry, we've got to say it, nothing much is going to happen. That's just it. You look at anything, nothing much is going to happen is the honest answer. But it does give us some breathing space for those of us who want to think, what is a more productive, more positive engagement level around that? So I think definitely let's get the lawyers together and think through around that. You know, I think I alluded earlier, in my mind, some of this, how do we get this right in governance and AI, to me is about upstream and downstream. I think the upstream stuff is much more difficult, which is what is that international governance over AI itself. Downstream, to me, is its practical impacts today in the world, and I think the UK can reflect on them. The work of the Institute is doing really well around what does this mean in terms of good work now? What do you need around it? I think we can, you know, we can solve many of the impacts at scale on the rest of us by actually having a good skills policy. I think by looking at our employment protections, most of our employment protections in the UK were largely designed in the old economy, when it was about hot metal, people scolding themselves, and physical risk in offices. We don't really have a concept of harm which is done digitally to people in terms of discrimination and others. And legalistically, you can cover it a bit. You know, so the biggest tool that unions use in this country and partly in Europe around this is, you know, data protection, GDPR. But GDPR is about individual privacy. We shouldn't be talking about, we shouldn't be resolving collective harms through something which is based around individual privacy. Because the risk of going down the individual privacy route is we take individual harms and impacts and we begin to move away from looking at that collective harms. The fact that something might be racist against an individual will also be racist against other people who may share that characteristics. So how do we understand that through equality law, equality prisms? Women who are discriminated will probably be discriminated as a set of women rather than just one individual woman. So you need both the individual harm and the collective harm. So working out what does that look like in terms of practical UK regulation, and there's been that debate about whether we have a single regulator or multiple regulator. To me, the bigger question is, what do we want from regulation, and we can work back. And I don't care if it's one agency or not, as long as those agencies have the resources to do the job and the skills to do the job. I think there's a danger of a single regulator in that it again reinforces the narrative that AI is so different to anything else we've ever experienced. But if AI can lead to us having differential health outcomes, or can lead to us being treated differently at work, or as consumer having different experiences, that's not unique. That's just discrimination that's happened or inequality that's happened. And maybe there are people out there who can deal with that if it's coordinated and resourced. So move away from exceptionalism and fix the things we can.
I'm zooming out a second. Purpose, as well as principles. Shall we just stop and very quickly whip round and then hear from anyone in the room as well? I mean, what, you know, in a sentence, what, if that's possible, Okay, yes. What is the purpose? What is the purpose of regulating AI in your views? How would you articulate that or begin to articulate that?
I think to me, it's about having a flexible tools. Flexible, I mean, because you will never have government that is up to speed and can follow all the time. I mean, that's the dream. It doesn't happen. So having flexible tools that can adapt to technological development, that can govern the behavior of people around building and using these technologies. That's how I see it. That will be the purpose.
And David, building on that, the ultimate purpose in terms of this direction might be.
I mean, in terms of purpose for me, it's building in democratic governance, social license, and public consent into how these technologies are designed, developed, and deployed, and what decisions are, how the decisions are made to actually engage in investing in or building technology. So I think for me, it's regulation's really important, but regulation has to sort of be laid over a foundation, a procedural foundation that ensures that people's voices are going to be included in the way the technology is actually designed.
Well, I didn't think it was going to have to be me that said human flourishing, but Andrew, is there anything you wish to add?
I think that's ultimately you need a purpose, and I think human flourishing is a good one. But I think there's a purpose around how do we maximise the benefits we can get for humanity through technology, whilst managing the risks and harms. Yeah. That to me is the ultimate principle. Yeah. And if you've got the principle, you can work towards it in different ways. My big fear in the UK is, and Europe a bit, is that we end up with the Dangerous Dogs Act of AI, where we end up being so specific about products or particular techniques that by the time we've done that, there'll be new breeds out there which are causing harms. So that flexibility is really important. And I know that's really, really hard to get flexibility and good regulation, but that has to be part of the means to achieve that maximising human benefit.
Can I just add one thing, Anna? And
yes,
I think that's just I think human flourishing is absolutely a kind of center of gravity. But there's also a kind of biospheric flourishing and this complex relationship between individual well-being, kind of societal flourishing, and the kind of greater biospheric whole. So I think I'm reflecting on how in more of the global conversations, there's been this kind of move to think about things like bon vivre, like good living, but living amidst, a kind of a natural environment that's, enabled by my behavior, and there's a flourishing that's beyond human flourishing in that sense.
Does anyone in the audience want to come in at this point?
Can I make one comment?
Yes. Here.
So Dr. Roman Chowdhury, over the last couple of days, she has some really nice turns of phrase, and one of the things she mentioned was regulation, something like brakes allow cars to go faster. So if you have the right regulation in place, if you have the right anyway, I'll talk really loudly. I've got it louder. If you have the right regulation in place, it allows you to innovate better and within the guardrails that you need. It allows you to create positive innovation. So one of the things she says, and she said at the U.S. Congress was, brakes make people drive faster because you feel comfortable that you can depend on those brakes, and that's what we don't have right now. And that's what we need.
Yeah, I wonder if this takes us to a conversation about common directions, things that we could do now, things that we could begin to think of capturing now, as opposed to the more domain or sector-specific things that must follow, the detail that must follow. Are there any, while we work out how to use Slido better, more effectively, is there anything anyone wants to say about common directions, things that we're seeing as common directions within the principles or within the regulatory models that we've been discussing today? Things like identifying stakeholders, shifts towards preemptive action.
Can I just bring on this, Anna, I'm sort of based on this perspective. So you're completely right. I mean, the issue is that I feel that this lack of guardrails and the lack of brakes is really harming this sort of innovation side, because there are a lot of companies that make really good things and they shelve it because they don't know what impact is going to be. They don't know if, and this is not good, you know. So I think that is exactly the point on why this is necessary. And it's funny because sorry, can I just say that you mentioned Roman Chowdhury and new words. I found that Joy Bull, reading that book, she came up with an amazing word, excoded. Did you see it? In talking about being coded out of services, and she just wrote this in a latest book, and she's used this word, excoded, which I found. Well, I'm sorry for it.
I mean, just to follow up on that, I think that what you were saying about impacts, I think, is one direction that we're moving towards, which is to say there are concerted efforts now to really think about what do sufficiently citizen involving or people involving impact assessments look like. I mean, there's this kind of group of governance processes that seem to be important. You've got a need for some form of risk analysis that can calibrate the sort of depth of governance intervention. You've got a need for some form of reflective anticipation through impact assessment that can kind of think through potential downstream harms and benefits. And then once you go through that, you've got a need for impact sort of mitigation measures and planning, and other ways of iterating on those other processes so that you're catching those potential downstream impacts that you might not have seen before the system went into the wild, right? So I do think that there's some common movement. I mean, UNESCO is working on this ethics impact assessment with their member states. You have the good work impact, was it the good work impact assessment? Is that what it's called? And then, of course, there's the HUDERIA in the Council of Europe, which is this human rights, democracy, and rule of law impact assessment. So there is that, I think there's that kind of momentum.
Is it aligned? Is ours aligned?
Yeah, I think so.
But yeah, as a side, as a PS. There's some more questions, I think, over here. Can I just check that everyone is in who wants to, and everyone can ask a question who wants to?
Okay, sure. Thank you. No, I'm just listening to the conversations about regulation, and I was just reflecting on something that was said in a session yesterday, another fringe session by Professor Stuart Russell from Berkeley. And when he was thinking about the future of AI and regulation, he said, and it gave me pause for thought, I don't know whether it's practical, but he said, we should be moving from making AI safe to making safe AI. So a basic design principle that, if we understand what the parameters of the risks are, the dangers, it is within our wit to design safer AI rather than regulate away the thing. So you regulate the parameters of that risk rather than put a patch on it later.
But isn't this what you were saying, David, to an extent? Because what you were saying to an extent is, which I thought was very good, which you said, what is missing is the value at the beginning, right? So to an extent, the big shift that we've had over recent months is that we've come to accept the inevitable, that all the development is inevitable, but we haven't asked the question before that. So if we say we make AI safe, we're basically accepting everything that comes through, and we're saying everything is okay, we just have to adopt and make it safe after we've done it, or in the way, but we haven't adopted the other way around principle, which is we'll make it if it's possible to make it safe in the first place.
One cautionary piece there, right, which is, and I didn't listen to Stuart's comment, but extrapolating on what I know of Stuart. I do think that this is an agency question, right? It's about where do we situate the kind of agency of control, right, in the way he would frame it. For me, that situating that agency always has to be dependent upon the human hands and human beings that are in the project life cycle, that are involved in making the decisions, right? There's a way in which one might frame safe AI as making, sort of moving from making AI safe to safe AI, is that the AI itself is safe, that it itself is designed and then kind of operates in the world safely as a safe agent.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be careful about that, because the kind of the predicate of safe, in that sense, will displace agency if we see that there are so-called kind of intelligent agents operating in the world that have this quality of being safe. So agency is an issue there that we need to just be careful about, just a qualification.
But just to qualify that,
Yeah.
he did say that agency included having an absolute stop, but that the technology doesn't run away from you. You actually can stop it.
Yeah, and I would say that very notion of the runaway technology is fallacious.
So we've got time, I'm afraid, only for one more question, which is going to be Rima, and then we're going to move on.
Good to see you back, Ivanna. I knew we couldn't keep you from the UK for too long. I have a question for our in-house privacy expert around the notion of privacy and how we need to rethink privacy. So is there something about collective privacy and network effects? And how does that apply to the future of work conversation? Because I think there was a group of people thinking about collective privacy, but it hasn't brought itself into the conversation about employees and workers. Can we do some more thinking on that? That was my question.
Definitely.
Totally. I mean, I don't think we can continue to see privacy then sort of with an individual approach anymore, because that's not going to work. And to an extent, one area that we haven't particularly explored and is becoming very, very evident now is the inextricable link between privacy and equality, for example, right? And that brings privacy on a more collective angle. Because when you ask privacy, the first question, the way I got into privacy, we've known each other for a long time, the way I got into privacy is not because of an individual element of it, or actually, I am one of the people that clicks a lot, yes, because I can't be bothered. That's not the point of privacy. Privacy is a privacy notice. I wouldn't even be in this field. What I'm interested in is the link between privacy and equality, the idea that when you ask privacy, you always ask the question, privacy for whom? Exactly. To me, that is the question, right? And again, that links with the collective vision of it. And that is something where there's been some initial thought, initial work on it, but we definitely need to dig much deeper on that. That's you.
Can I just one thing on making it, because I think that's absolutely right, and this is why we need more conversations like this, because there's a risk that we have a conversation and I think there seems to be some shared grounding of what we think regulation is for. There'll be other conversations where regulation is for something very different. And if you look at the regulatory nature of the UK or many other countries, in effect, it is regulation based on a 1970s, 80s neoliberal model, where good regulation means about economic competition. And actually conversations about equality, about social rights, about environmental protection, there is a hierarchy in regulation. So I don't believe when this government says about regulation that they mean my version of it, and they don't have to, because they're different people to me. But when the UK government or other governments talk about regulation, there are hierarchies of principle within that. So just talking about regulating AI means we could end up with a multiplicity of different meanings from it. And that's why I worry about the closed shop that's happening in Bletchley Park, because it's people with power and privilege and economic interest who are talking about regulation. Here, we're talking about values and purpose. And we've got to take values and purpose into the room where the people with power talk about regulation.
This is plainly the start of a conversation, and
it's
not the
David
end.
Leslie said, because it's not only false, it's deeply irresponsible. He said we don't need to worry about AI running away, but in fact there is emergent AI. There are capabilities that have not been expected in the latest AI models. They've taken people by surprise, and moreover, new people are combining them together in ways that they don't understand. So we should take these risks very seriously, and to deny taking them seriously is irresponsible. On the point Stuart Russell was making, it's not just, it's a technical point for us. We must put more technical effort into the swap switch. Let's test it. Let's be sure that, like we test firewalls, let me test that. So I do understand that. And as regards Andrew, I think there's a lot of civil society people actually present there at Bletchley Park. It's not just the insiders, there's lots of outsiders there too. So I don't want this even go away with two such misleading points.
Well, thank you for your contribution, which we can continue when we're finished. We've had for now themes, as Andrew said, not just of power and privilege, but also of participation, of purpose and principle. And on that note, I'm going to wind up this section and hand over to Professor Gina Neff, who is going to, and thank you very much, panelists, for your excellent contributions and the start of a very